Well, Stats SA has not that long ago released the unemployment data showing that the unemployment rate has come down ever so slightly to 32.1% in the third quarter. That compares with 33.5% in the second quarter. To get more detail on this and to discuss, to focus as well, particularly on youth unemployment, I'm joined by Xhanti Payi. He's an economist at PWC, and a little bit later, Waseem Carrim, the CEO of the National Youth Development Agency, will be joining us as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Xhanti. So, slightly lower unemployment rate, but still hideously high for the country. We see that there were quite a number of jobs created in the formal and the informal sector. Just break that down for us.
Yeah, I think actually more of the numbers seem to suggest that more jobs were created in the informal sector. And it's important to recognize what the informal sector is. Those small businesses were probably not paying tax, or those individual workers or people who work for their own accounts. And that's an important trend that has happened actually since the global financial crisis, certainly since the COVID incidents, because that was somewhere where everybody was told, look, it looks like you're on your own, you're going to have to look for jobs, or you have to create employment. And I think many people have been able to do that. But it also suggests that, those smaller businesses need a little bit more support, because clearly they are a little bit more resilient than the bigger businesses that we've been able to see.
Yeah, and then interesting to see that discouraged workers, a number of them, actually increased by 160,000. Please define what a discouraged worker is and how concerned you are about that number.
Yeah, so those are people who have not gone looking for employment over a period of time. So I think it's about 2 to 3 weeks where they're asked, have you been out there looking for work? And so when you stop looking, it's usually for various reasons, because I've been looking and I can't find something. Or, as we also know, that it's very expensive to look for work. So people who are no longer looking because I don't have taxi fare, I don't have train fare to be able to show up at a place where I look for work. And that number has grown. And you would have thought, actually, given the positivity we've heard about the GNU, that number would have fallen significantly, especially in the last 3 months, the quarter-on-quarter number. But it hasn't, but it just outlines that actually in the real sense, in the real economic sector, people are still, while they're positive in terms of the outlook, where they're hiring, they're still, facing the same constraints in terms of looking for work or believing that they can find work. Yeah.
Before I go to Waseem, I just want to get clarity from you on what the youth unemployment number looks like.
So there are two numbers. The first one is that number between the ages of 15 to 24. Those are usually very inexperienced young people. They have just come out of varsity. But the number here also reflects people who are not in employment, not in training, and not in, at school. And that number is around 34%. But if you look all the way to what we call as youth, which is about 18 to 34, that number is about 42%. Again, these are young people who are not in training. So we're not saying that they are at school. They are not training, they are not at school, they are not in jobs. So basically, they are sort of what we are starting to worry about as sort of the lost generation, because they're not earning any skills, so they're sitting at home. Yeah. Around 42%, much higher than the 32% you've just highlighted.
Yeah. Waseem, thank you very much for joining us. Of course, you're at the NYDA, and your job is really to assist the youth in trying to deal with this issue of the scourge of high unemployment, particularly for the youth. When you hear that the latest numbers are still hovering more or less, where they are, what is your immediate reaction?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to provide commentary today. So I think the one thing we must recognize is that there is no substitute for economic growth in our economy. The reality is that unemployment and youth unemployment was lowest when our economy was growing, right? And therefore, what is critically important is that we continue to drive the structural reforms in the economy in key sectors like energy, logistics, crime, connectivity, that will enable us to get the kind of investment we need to bring down unemployment. There is no substitute for that.
Yeah.
With that being said, there is a lot that we can do. We often reflect to say, we can't say to young people, you have to wait for changes in the economy to be able to be employed. So there's a number of things that we can do in the interim, right? Number one, we can make work seeking a little bit easier. As my colleague would have said, the cost of work seeking is high. So we're looking at repurposing the SRD grant, turning it into some kind of work seeker grant to reduce the cost of looking for work, right? For example, we have the National Pathway Management Network, sayouth.mobi, which is a data-free platform where young people can access learning and earning opportunities closest to where they live, making the work search a little bit better. And then lastly, let me say two last things. Small enterprise development is critical, right? While there's no silver bullet for unemployment, we have far lower small businesses than the rest of Africa and the rest of the world. So it's another opportunity for us to get more young people into self-employment. And then the last point is that the state plays a key role through public employment programs, right? The massive expansion of public employment programs that provide critical work experience for young people that enable their transition into longer forms of employment are critical if we're going to address the jobs crisis.
Yeah, Waseem, thank you for that contribution. I saw you frantically nodding your head at some of the points.
No, well, I think there's an interesting thing and a trend that's very, very important to recognize, and we have to be careful about this, about that relationship between economic growth and employment, that it seems actually that it has started to break apart, and that's not very surprising because the structure of the economy itself is changing. So we are, for example, just the recovery between the time we had the the COVID crisis, and now it took us a very long time to recover those jobs, even though the economy itself had recovered. So we're growing. The economy went back to its size much earlier than we actually saw the recovery in the jobs. So it tells us that actually the growth itself is no longer enough to actually get to the jobs that you need. And so that is something that's important, because I guess the structure of the economy is, and also it's also important to think about how do we see people going to work and being productive and therefore creating the growth, or the growth itself happening by itself without the people being there. Because we've got to believe that the economy can grow without people, so that you can say, we need growth to create jobs. You've got to have to see that number, and then you say, okay, cool, now that the number has happened, can we see? And that's a strange thing to happen, but it tells us that it is possible that we can grow the economy without actually bringing in the number of people in. And what kind of interventions are important? I think Waseem is important to, obviously, they are engaging in these things. What kinds of things do we have to do so that actually, as you are growing with people participating? And that's a very difficult thing. At PWC, we did this work for the period between 2010 and 2020 to just look at that relationship, and we find actually that the growth itself is actually taking in less people over a period of time. So that relationship has changed, and that's going to require the public and the private sector to work a little bit harder if we are looking to actually bring people along in the growth discussion.
Yeah. Well, so what kind of work is the NYDA doing to try and make a little bit of a difference when it comes to this youth unemployment problem?
Yeah, so we are partners to the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, which, of course, the President launched in 2020 as a mechanism to start to address some of the challenges that we face. But really, we see three components of work, right? One is the Youth Enterprise Development Strategy. And just to give you a quick statistics, if you look around the world, if you look particularly at our peers, we find about 30% of the population involved in self-employment activities here. In South Africa, that figure is closer to 10%. So if we could just match our peers globally in terms of self-employment activities, that could help us to halve our unemployment rate in South Africa. Of course, it's not easy. How do we wake up in the morning and say, all young people must be entrepreneurs? You have to create the ecosystem through training, through business development support, through access to finance and access to markets that enable young people to be able to thrive in the small enterprise sector. And that's where a big component, together with our partners, the work is focused on. Number two is really having a demand-led strategy around youth, right? And I think it speaks to what my colleague would have said, is to say, we spend a lot of our time talking to employers and say, what do you feel is the barriers holding you back from employing young people? In some cases, it's a work experience gap. In some cases, it's a skill gap, right? But what we're trying to do is create better return on investments. So when we train young people, we're actually training them for demand that exists in the economy and not just training them for certification. The last component, and this one we're very passionate about, right, is that if we look at transitions of young people, if we look at particularly young people leaving school, right, many of them go to university, and we know generally getting a university degree is a good indicator of being able to find long-term sustainable employment. Some are able to find a foothold in the labor market. We have many young people who are hustlers and are able to start out their own enterprises. But there's this huge cohort of young people who leave school and become lost to the system. And that's where we believe South Africa needs a structured national youth service program, which is 12 months of guaranteed work experience by the state that will enable young people to gather the work experience, the skills, and the capacity that they need to be able to transition from the learning environment that is school into the working environment, which is earning.
Xhanti, just to pick on a couple of things that Waseem said, he talked about the presidential youth jobs incentive and so on, which I think is quite aligned to the public, what do you call it, the
PIV, yeah.
Yes, please say in full because it's just escaped me.
The Public Works
Expanded Public Works program, pardon me. So to me, it just feels like people kind of get these piecemeal kind of jobs.
Yeah.
How effective is that in actually building people's capacity and ability to then go and work in another place, and actually work sustainably? How impactful is it?
It's a very, very important question in the sense that when you actually want, one of the things we want to give people is not just sort of some work experience, especially in areas where they're working but they may not transition. So, for example, we want also to give them work ethic so that when they go, because employers are wanting to see, is this person capable of delivering? Can they be self-starters? Are they able to actually show up on time and consistently? And some of our programs are not actually helpful in that sense because young people get used to sort of working 2 weeks and then off, and then they have a little bit of income and maybe they spend it because it's not enough, for example, to do anything sustainable. They may drink it, they may do other things. So we need to also be very focused on this idea of providing some sort of work experience that actually also delivers work ethic so that when an employer takes that person on, they know that this is somebody who's used to working for a sustainable period of time. Therefore, I can entrust them, for example, for a long-term project. I can entrust them to be consistent in terms of helping me deliver on what I need them to do. And so that's part of the psychology also of work, that it's not only the fact that you've gotten a job for 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, is that actually you believe that you can work consistently and grow within a program. And that's part of what we need to do in terms of doing that. And I think Waseem, what he's saying around that full year is probably quite important. Because at least you'll be allowed to say, look, even if we have you at the Department of Health, I know the Minister of Education had some of these programs at the Minister of Health, it might be important over a period of time to say, we are actually training young people to be able to be fit for work. And that fitness muscle for work is something that we have to also build so that employers can trust and be able to take in young people. So there is that difference as well.
We do have a couple of minutes left. Waseem, please just give me your final comments around this issue. It's a broad issue, but we've run out of time. Your last few comments.
Yeah, I want to respond to that last point, right? And I sometimes think, yes, EPWP, CWP, they have their drawbacks, but I sometimes think they get a bad rep when somebody takes a picture of, maybe EPWP worker sleeping under a tree. And it's such isolated events where that happens. But I think we need to redefine in our minds the concept of work, right? Because I think, yes, work has a very important economic value, but work has also an extreme social value, right? You just think about young people who wake up in the morning and need to feel like they have some place to go, And I think the lack of work and the hopelessness and the indignity that it creates has much longer social effects for our country, And I think we need to think about whether we want to cultivate a generation of young people who feel like they need to stand in the queue at the post office every month to collect a social grant, or do we want a generation of young people who feel like they are active citizens of this democracy, like they actually are valued citizens of our country, right? And I think what our colleague mentioned as well is to say there's so much work to be done. There's work digitizing Home Affairs records, and there's work to be done in public hospitals in South Africa. So the more we think about the social and the concept of how we identify work and the value that our young people can add to society, the more I think we'll start to value it and we'll invest in quality kind of programs that not only contribute to young people, but also contribute to the greater good of South Africa.
Excellent. Thank you, Waseem. 30 seconds, a few comments?
I think just to add to that, one is also going to be important is that, the value of that work is important and what people get paid paid. And for example, I've been very encouraged to see the train system coming back, because that's an important part of this looking for work, but also what value they can get from that work, because if you spend a little bit less on transport and actually, more on what you need and what your family needs, that money actually circulates better in the community. So that is also important in terms of what government has to do to support work efforts, is to provide the ability for people to have an effective and cheap transport system that allows people to get the real value of actually working.
Thank you so much. Xhanti, thank you so much. And Waseem, for your time. Xhanti Payi is an economist at PWC, and Waseem Carrim is the CEO of the National Youth Development Agency, for their contributions there on this very important topic of youth unemployment.